Frank Giles with Agnet Media and the editor in chief of Specialty Crop Grower Magazine. And I'm joined by Bob Hochmuth, who is the University of Florida regionalized specialized extension agent for vegetables, and he's based up in Live Oak. Bob, welcome.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Good to see you, Frank.
Great. Well, we've been writing quite a bit about Fusarium wilt in watermelons lately, and we have a story in our April issue about it. And you're quoted in the story as well. And so we wanted to have you on to talk a little bit more about the problem of Fusarium wilt in watermelon, and just talk about how big of an issue it's become in the Swanee Valley area in North Florida in general.
Yeah, Fusarium wilt probably has emerged over the past decade to be perhaps one of the most serious production problems in this particular region. Recently in January, the Florida Watermelon Association Research Committee had sort of a thinking tank kind of a deal and identified silverleaf whitefly viruses and Fusarium wilt as the top two research needs for the industry on a statewide basis. But in the case of Fusarium for this region, it probably is more, it is more important. And so it's emerged into one of the top production challenges that we have for sure.
So, is there any accounting for why it's become so bad in that area?
Yeah, I would lay it on two things. Years ago, when we grew mostly seeded watermelons, and especially things that were related to Crimson Sweet, there was a fair bit of tolerance to Fusarium in seeded watermelons in those days. Once the advent of seedless watermelons became the driving force and the majority of the watermelons that were growing, the seedless varieties just don't have that same tolerance at all. So I think one thing is that the seedless watermelon is much more susceptible to damage from Fusarium wilt. And then the other thing in pockets in this region, there's just not the land availability that there used to be. So again, if you go back a few decades, there was plenty of pasture land with Bahia grass, and you could develop a good rotation of 6 or 7 years before you went back into a field with watermelon. But today, that's not the case. And so we're losing a lot of that agricultural land to urbanization and other kinds of things. And so it makes the land less available within, small regions. And so those are the two driving forces, the loss of available land for a good long rotation, and then the variety situation with seedless, they're just not as tolerant.
That's good segue to the next question. What are some of the options that growers have when it comes to managing Fusarium in watermelon?
Yeah. In parts of the region here where there's less intense acreage, the rotation is still the main thing. And that's, I don't want to say that we don't have that available to us, because in certain areas, the rotation is still the mainstay where they can do that. So that's really, really important. The variety situation, we're beginning to see some movement where we're at least seeing differences among seedless varieties, but nothing that I would get too excited about in terms of saying, well, if I plant that variety, that I'm not going to have a Fusarium problem. So that's the second thing. The third one is that there are some fungicides that are helpful, but not really curative. And so things like Proline that can be used early in these materials have to be used early in the season. So there are some chemical options that are available. We also know that if we delay plantings until the soil is a little bit warmer, that the Fusarium has a disadvantage in comparison to the health of the watermelon plant. But that doesn't work out very well because we're so driven to get to these early markets. So even though we know from a research standpoint that that's a really good thing to do, it doesn't fit in a lot of what they're doing. And then the final one that is the best option we have available to us now is the use of grafted watermelons. And so this is a situation where they would use a rootstock that has resistance or tolerance to Fusarium. And there's a couple of different species of things that are used there. but the primary rootstock that's used in this area is Carolina strongback, and then they would take the watermelon variety, whatever variety they're using, and graft it on top of the rootstock, which is Carolina strongback. And there's a little clip that holds them together and that heals over, and then you take that transplant out to the field. So you get the benefit of whatever variety characteristics you want, but you also get the benefit of the fusarium tolerance from the rootstock as well. So all of those that I mentioned are being used to some degree, but in a situation where things are really serious with fusarium, I feel like the best bet for them, maybe the only bet to really manage it, is going to be grafted watermelons, but it comes with its own challenges as well.
So we recently did a story with a grower up in that way, BJ Wilkerson, who's adopted grafted plants on a pretty big scale because of the very reasons that you said. How has the adoption been in general among growers up there?
Yeah, I think that in terms of controlling or managing fusarium, I think that the growers that have adopted it have all felt very positive about that. And in some of these fields, and BJ would be one of those that's in that sort of that pocket of hot fusarium land, and so in situations where they know that they're gonna likely get a high incidence of fusarium, then the grafted watermelon plants have done really, really well in terms of managing fusarium. However, there are some challenges that come along with it. Number one, they're very expensive, so that in those situations where you know you're going to need it, perhaps it is worth the investment. But the investment in grafted watermelons is probably something in the range of 3 to 4 times a regular seeded our seedless watermelon transplant. So it's a very expensive proposition. The other thing that's challenging in this area is that, or makes it challenging, is that the grafted watermelons tend to be a little bit later to first harvest. So maybe 5 to 7 days, but let's say a week plus or minus on average, that the first harvest is going to be delayed. Well, that's very, very important from a profitability standpoint because the price typically after that first harvest period before Memorial Day, the prices tend to drop. So it's more difficult to make it profitable with grafted watermelons because of this delay in first harvest. And in certain areas of the country, they might have many more than 3 or 4 harvests. But for us, we've got a narrow window before Georgia comes in, and so that we don't have the luxury of having the full benefit of a grafted watermelon plant because it's a very strong plant, comes in a little bit late, but then maintains a lot of vigor for a long period of time. So that if it would be probably able typically to get higher overall yields with grafted, but everything's going to be shifted later. And so that shift to later harvests means, typically on a 10-year average, less likelihood of profitability. And a lot of times after Memorial Day, the price drops pretty pretty quickly. So that's the thing that we have going against us here in this immediate area. If you go to other states in the northern part of the country, they can continue to harvest for a long period of time. And in those areas, they would be able to probably get the maximum benefit from a grafted plant because they're going to be strong late. Whereas here, we just are out by the time that we get to that point.
That was one thing BJ mentioned about the delay in maturity. And of course, they've got enough acres, I guess, that he can kind of work that into his planting schedule.
Yes.
So it also gets back to this whole how early can you go?
Yeah.
And I know that's always the conversation in your part of the world. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Um, yeah, this year was the year that kind of recalibrated us, I think. If you go back to 20 or 30 years ago, we hardly ever even thought about transplanting watermelons before March 1st here. But now we're sort of driven by this demand to get things well before Memorial Day to think about putting a lot of our acreage in plus or minus, but around March 1st. Well, the cold risk is high, very high during that period of time. And this year we had a freeze in the middle of March, and we were essentially 100% planted. Not quite, but we were at least 95% planted. And we experienced the same thing that they did in South Florida early in their production season. And I'm telling you, we were a couple of degrees or a couple of hours away from losing everything. So we have about 10,000 acres in this region, and so I think it just signifies how important it is for them to take the risk to plant early to try to take advantage of some of that higher price watermelons. So that's the challenge overall. We see much earlier transplanting, but then when you look at a grafted watermelon plant, now you've got 3 or 4 times the money in that plant, and it makes that risk even greater. So in some cases, for the grafted watermelons in this area, back in our freeze in the middle of March, that there was some things that were done to sort of physically cover the plants, whether it's putting handfuls of hay on them or paper plates or wax paper or something to make sure that we didn't lose those grafted plants. Not all grafted plants were covered, but it's still undetermined whether the grafted transplant is more or less tolerant to cold. But I'm going to say it's not a whole lot different. You're at big risk if it's going to be 28, 29, 30 degrees, no matter what kind of watermelon transplant you have out there.
Well, Bob, we appreciate you joining us for this quick video. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Not just appreciate the opportunity, and we hope for the best. I think the research that needs to be driven to help find some solutions for this fusarium, not just in this area but statewide and across the country. We're not the only ones that are seeing more and more fusarium. But thanks for the opportunity to join you.
Great. Well, we'll keep in touch with you as that keeps moving forward, and we'll have you back soon.
Okay, thank you.